Euan Bennet is at University of Glasgow, and he has done a lot of work with the EID data. But what's most exciting about Euan is that he has done a lot of other international work, so he can kind of give us some perspective, and he's deeply involved in the racing epidemiology data. So, Euan, I'll let you take over.
Excellent. Right. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me, Mick. And as Mick said, I'm a lecturer at the University of Glasgow Vet School. My original background is astrophysics. So when I started this job, I just about knew how many legs a horse has. Thankfully, that wasn't really a requirement for the sort of work that I'm doing. But I've now been working on epidemiology of equine sports, essentially, for about the last 9 years. And starting off with FEI, endurance and eventing, and then broadening out to add the US racing, the EID. So we're talking quite a lot about that tonight. And most recently, Hong Kong racing. And I just want to give a shout out to my two sort of key collaborators in a lot of this work, Professor Tim Parkin, who's now at the University of Bristol, formerly of Glasgow, and Dr. Heather Cameron-Whittock at University of Central Lancashire. So we've worked together on a lot of these different things. These are some of the titles of the papers that we've published that you may or may not be familiar with. This is just a little bit of a who is this guy slide for the people that aren't familiar. And I've just got a very quick overview of what I'll be talking about tonight. I'm going to try and summarize the current state of risk factor models in epidemiology, at least as far as the ones I've worked on. I'll talk about the current state of surface data collected by the jurisdictions, again, that are within my sort of first-hand knowledge. And then I'll try and summarize what some of the next steps are. So I think this actually does follow on quite nicely from Lars's talk, who finished by mentioning the challenges of the kind of epidemiological study of the surface data. So hopefully it will be on theme for that. So let's talk about the current state of risk factor models. So just to give you an idea, when we're talking about epidemiological models, I never want anyone to think that we're talking about using some sort of predictive statistical model to replace any other work that's going on, or to even replace any sort of decision making that's already going on. And the reason for it is quite simple. In 2022, the incidence of racehorse fatality in North America, so this is from the EID, was 1.25 fatalities per 1,000 race starts. What that means is that the best possible predictive model is a model that says no horse will ever die. That model would be correct 98.75% of the time. Clearly, that is unhelpful and ridiculous. The equally ridiculous corollary is if we didn't have any racing, if no horse ever started a race, then we would prevent all fatalities. So these statements should pretty much be treated as equivalent in my view. Neither of them are helpful. And so the goal is not to try and beat this sort of null model, because how are we going to beat a model that's that powerful, that it's right 99% of the time? I don't think it's feasible. So we're never talking about trying to use a predictive model to make any decisions. Predictive modeling or any sort of statistical modeling are just tools to be added to the arsenal. And just to summarize what I guess I could say some jurisdictions are still doing, they are in a cycle, an FAFO cycle, you might say, where racing continues, horses are exposed to the same old risks, fatalities occur, and as a result, damage to the sport grows. And by damage, I've just sort of nodded towards economic damage and social license to operate. Obviously, we could talk all day about other consequences of perceptions when fatalities occur. And this is kind of the cycle that has existed without really, when there isn't sort of collaboration between industry and academia, at least from my point of view, as somebody that's trying to have an impact in the real world. It's all very well publishing papers and things like that, but what's the point if no one does anything as a result of our work? What we've found, and this is based on the various bits of work that I've been doing over the last 9 years, is that when we do get that engagement, when we do get that engagement between the industry and the research, then this adds like a whole new sub-cycle to this cycle of perception of the racing industry or equine sports, really, where if we have the time to perform some sort of holistic study of the available data and understand that the risks are multifactorial, then we can actually identify risk factors that can be mitigated. And again, there's no point in doing that just for the sake of it. We need to communicate this and get it implemented. So the two key steps at the bottom here are communicating and implementation. But what we have found, and I've got a couple of examples of this to come, that once this step is inserted, we do get reduced risks, we get fewer fatalities, and I mean, hopefully, this might be a bold claim, but hopefully the sort of ongoing damage to the sport is mitigated in terms of public perception, economic damage, all the rest of it. I don't know if I've got any citations to back that up. This is just my sort of hope, really. So when I'm talking about industry engagement with research, I've got some great examples and I've got some not so great examples that we could talk about. But the main lessons from the last 9 years for me have been that turning the fundamental research into real world change is not a one-off event. It's an ongoing process and it takes time. It takes time to change minds. It takes time to change policy. And it is a continuous process with feedback in both directions. And the biggest lesson for me over the last sort of few years of this has been that the relationship building between academia and industry is such a key part of this process. And a key part of that relationship building involves being honest that there's going to be no magic solution to reducing the risk to the horses, and that every recommended intervention that we can make is just a tool. It's another tool that can be applied. And the important thing about when we're using tools is that we use them properly. So every intervention that we can recommend is just a tool that can be applied or not. And our go-to phrase is aggregation of marginal gains. There's not going to be a single intervention at this point that's discovered that reduces the risk of fatality by 50% on its own. But if we can get 10 or 15 or 20 small interventions, the cumulative effect of that could be extremely important. And like I said, it's an ongoing process. So just to summarize, a brief history of risk factor models with a disclaimer that these are the ones I have first-hand knowledge of. Of course, there are others going on. So some of the people in this room and on the call, we'll be working on different things, and please don't be offended if I don't mention what you're doing. This is very much like from my own knowledge. So when I started off working in this job, I was working on FEI endurance data, so the global equine injury survey, as they called it. And for that, we had competition records of every international endurance competition for the last 10 years or something at the time. And that was about it, really. It was mainly the competition data that we had. And the outcome for endurance was failure to qualify. So if you're not familiar, endurance is very long distance competitions, and they have multiple vet exams during each competition. And if the vet thinks they're lame or they've got metabolic problems, they'll get a failure to qualify. They're not allowed to continue. So that's the deleterious outcome. And these are a lot more common than fatalities. So up to 30 to 35% of horse starts in endurance competitions will get an FTQ. And it's quite a common outcome. For eventing, the outcome of interest is horse falls during cross country, usually. And again, we had the global eventing database from the FEI. So every horse start in a FEI eventing competition over the same sort of time period. And for both of these, the sort of predictive power, if you like, of the models, measured by the area under the receiver operating curve, is about 65 to 70%. So I'm extremely oversimplifying this, but pretty much what we can say there is that those models, the parameters included in those models, could explain around 65 to 70% of the associated risk factors with the outcomes. So it's better than tossing a coin, but it's maybe not good enough to base any decisions off of. Unfortunately, along the way, there were many risk factors identified that could be addressed and mitigated, and that's really the purpose of this work, as I said earlier. Next up, we've got North American racing. So this is the EID, covering all horse racing starts in the USA and Canada. And for that, we've got a few more pieces of data. In addition to all the competition records, so all of the race starts and all of the fully validated outcomes recorded, we've got some training records and some veterinary information. The outcome for this, the main outcome of interest is fatalities. But of course, we can use the idea to do lots of other different studies, and we have done over the last few years. And of course, fatalities are a much rarer outcome than either of the outcomes that we're interested in for the FEI stuff. Despite this, excuse me, the performance of the models was improved because there's additional information available. And we're pushing towards 70 or 75% predictive power. Again, that's massively oversimplified. So, you know, and then finally, most recently, my work on the Hong Kong racing database is for my sort of, in my view, for the data I've worked on, Hong Kong is the current gold standard, if you like, if that's a helpful phrase for you, because every horse in Hong Kong is under really intense scrutiny, and they record a lot of detail about every day of every horse's life. And so in addition to comprehensive competition records and the outcomes that we're interested in, we have complete training records. So every training run every horse does, and extensive veterinary records of treatment and diagnostics. And the main outcome of interest, or two outcomes of interest we've been working on for Hong Kong. One is post-race lameness. The other is what they call unacceptable performance. And I think if I'm remembering correctly, unacceptable performance is if the horse finishes more than 12 lengths behind the winner. So they've done really badly. The goal is for, of course, all the horses to be pretty close together. And if they're not doing that, then they're not performing to the best of their ability. So there's two outcomes that we've looked at in Hong Kong. But with the addition of the full training records, the full veterinary records, or really extensive veterinary records, excuse me, we're getting towards 80 to 85% area under the curve. And that's kind of how things have progressed for me over the last 9 years. So we've known for some time that the limit to all of this is depth of data, not breadth of data. What I mean by that is just adding more race starts in doesn't really change anything. The EID is now at 5 million race starts. Adding another 500,000 doesn't really improve the predictive ability. The Hong Kong database is about 100,000, about 120,000 at the moment, plus about 4 million training starts. The thing that made the Hong Kong database have slightly more predictive power than the EID is the additional training data, the additional veterinary data. So it's the depth, it's the new data types that make the difference. And we've seen there in the previous slides, I included those as an example to show what can be gained by adding new data sources, because these new data sources give us a more complete picture of the risks that are affecting the horses. However, this doesn't mean that the answer is, let's just throw more data at it and see what happens. It's also very clear from my work and from my experience that we need to be quite thoughtful and strategic about how we proceed. Excuse me. So as we know, the risks of the deleterious outcomes, whether it's fatal injury, falls, lameness, all of these outcomes are multifactorial. And it's challenging to try and model all of the potential risk factors And adding new potential risk factors is a very intensive process. Just to give you an idea, the Hong Kong database, the Hong Kong database came to me as 30 different databases that had to be reconciled together. And that resulted in over 400 risk factors to be analysed. And each of those had to be created with intention. It wasn't a case, you couldn't just feed all the data into the computer and wait for it to spit out an answer. And each of these risk factors had to be assessed by a human with some knowledge to figure out what is the best form of this variable, what is the best way to analyze this, what actually makes sense. So it was a very challenging process. I think the original reconciliation of the Hong Kong database took me about 6 months just to put all that data together. And so when we're talking about new surface level data becoming available, there will be a similar intensive process and a collaborative process to identify the useful parts of that and to make sure that we're identifying forms of risk factors that are investigable, interpretable, and actionable. And so this, for me, this is one of the biggest challenges that we're facing here. So what's the current state of surface data? Again, with the caveat that this is in my experience. Well, I did some asking around because a lot of the time, the surface data is not routinely part of the databases that I've been working on. And so, for example, for the FEI endurance and eventing, there was nothing that was routinely recorded as part of the GEIS. And as we've heard already tonight, there is ongoing work to gather data at events, and that's great. And as we also heard, that is going to take time to sort of build up to the level of the sort of global database. For the EID, in the EID, we've got surface type and going, and we've got lots of other data coming online, and then that has existed in various forms over the last 15 years or so. For Hong Kong racing, in the database, we've got surface type. They've got 3 racetracks in Hong Kong. 2 of them are all weather, which is not the same as synthetic. It's closer to dirt in the EID, as it turns out. And there's 1 turf. I think I've got that the right way around. And they have done other studies on the going on. They've done petometer studies on the turf track and Clegg hammer studies on the all-weather tracks. And they've planned some sort of hoof impact accelerometer study, but that's not quite taken off yet. So presently for Hong Kong, we've got surface type in the database. We don't have anything else. Another database I've worked on a little bit is the Irish racing database. They've got going recorded. I've said all turf tracks. I think that's true. I don't know for sure. Going is measured manually and subjectively. And there are some records of watering, cutting grass, resowing, etc. And there's a lot of knowledge. What I found out is there's a lot of knowledge in people's heads that's not recorded anywhere. So people that are managing these tracks know a lot about them, but that's not routinely recorded in a systematic way. So again, at the moment for the Irish racing database, the going is maybe useful. Anything else, not in a usable form as far as the database for epidemiological studies is concerned. That's not to say it's not useful for other purposes, of course, and that same goes for all of these. So for Professor Peterson's team, what we've identified is the vast amount of work and data that is being recorded can roughly be split into 3 groups classified by temporal frequency, essentially. So there are low frequency observations, which are updated sometimes over multiple years. And these are things like if the track is renovated, if there's a significant change to the configuration or the materials in the track, things that don't happen very often. Then there's the mid-frequency, where there are things that are measured every track meet, maybe, or perhaps seasonally, so maybe multiple times in the same calendar year. And these include things like composition, grading, the track base, maintenance records, and there are specific measurements for each surface type that I couldn't all fit on this one slide. And then the high frequency observations are things that are measured once a day or perhaps even more frequently. And these include variables such as rainfall, temperature, evaporation rate, moisture, cushion depth, penetration resistance. Now, some of these, like the weather data, is available in 15-minute increments, which is amazing. It's an overwhelming amount of data to contemplate, frankly. And I did say when we discussed this before that if someone handed me that as an unfiltered data set, I would probably cry and then never talk to them again. So if you might be thinking, this sounds great, why don't we just add it into the EID? And this is a question that has been fielded by both Mick and ourselves at various times over the years, I think. And the answer is we wish it could be that simple. And where we've kind of landed in recent discussions is that some of the low and mid-frequency variables could be added quite easily in principle to the EID, which is updated once per year. And so it would make sense that that data update, which updates everything else for the previous calendar year, could just have a few new variables added. And that's great, and that will work quite nicely for a few of the variables. One of the challenges is that when we're talking about the risk factor models and the epidemiological studies, because the outcomes of interest are at the race start level, so the outcome is horse fatality in the race, that means that we need all of the other data to be at that same resolution. So the challenge is to reconcile the observations that have a high spatial frequency. So anything that involves measuring the track in multiple locations, for example. How do we flatten that into one observation per race start, essentially? And there's a lot of work to be done, as Lars alluded to as well, to figure this out. It will be possible, but we just can't answer it right now. For the high frequency observations, we have a double problem. We'd have to work out how to resolve them at or near the race start level. And if we could do that, again, they could be added to the EID. And in some cases, variables such as weather observations, which are in 15-minute increments, that might actually line up almost to the race start times if we wanted to be that precise about it, and we probably could be. Then there's the additional challenge of those observations which are also high spatial frequency that have multiple measurements per track on different locations on the track. And so that would be a particular challenge where we've got a sort of 2 dimensions of additional resolution that we're trying to smooth out into just give us a one number or one description for this race start. So with that said, I think I've kind of spoiled my next slide with some of my waffling there, but or one of the upcoming slides. It is great that we've got new data sources that are becoming available, and we know that that does improve our epidemiological models, but there's a lot of work, and we need to do this thoughtfully, and especially we need to do this collaboratively, because there are people who have been working on these things for years that know how all of these variables actually work. And that is the insight that we need and the expertise that will be required to figure out how to solve this problem of resolving at the level of the race start. One of the things that I've seen that might be of interest is if we want to understand does the amount of rainfall 2 days before the race affect the risk of fatality? Well, that's a hypothesis. Let's figure out how we can resolve that variable, and we can add that into a multifactorial risk factor model and see if it hangs around the same way as we do with all of the other risk factors or potential risk factors. I've said this already, or alluded to it already, that any of our models are just tools to help inform decisions, including decisions relating to interventions for risk management. And we will never recommend that a predictive model is the only intervention or the only decision-making process, because, of course, the no horse will ever die model will always be better than it. But what we can do is provide recommendations and maybe potentially some tools that can help the people that are on the ground that are making these decisions. So one of the examples, one of the things that we are in the process of implementing in Hong Kong is the grandly named real-time risk prediction system, which kind of works almost uniquely for Hong Kong, where they have during the season they have 2 race nights a week, and there's a vet exam 2 or 3 days before each race night. And because there's a time difference, because they're like 9 hours ahead of us, we can actually turn around a sort of risk factor model that's based on data that includes data from that final vet exam, and give them a list of the horses that are at the highest risk of post-race lameness, for example, according to the model. Now, that isn't used as a reason to scratch the horse. The goal of this is to give the vet who's examining them on the day of the race a bit of extra information. So it's to help someone that's got the expert knowledge to make a decision. It's giving them an extra piece of information that they wouldn't otherwise have. So if the vet's thinking, well, not too sure about this horse, and has that additional information of, well, they're in the top 5% riskiest of all profiles because of their recent history, that might help them to make a decision, which might prevent a bad outcome. But the point is, the model isn't making the decision. There's a human making the decision. And that's true for everything that we're doing here. That's what we always want to emphasize. So let's talk about aggregation of marginal gains. This is a phrase that we really like to use. I think it was popularized by the British cycling team in the context of winning Olympic medals. The idea, I think, for cycling was that, there's not going to be one single thing that you change that's going to make you win, but if you get the right material for your bike and the right pedals and the right wheels and the right aerodynamic helmet, and you do everything, then that's enough to win you the gold medal. So you focus on lots of small things. And one of the headline success results is that from 2009 to 2022, the risk of fatality for racehorses in North America fell by 38%. And so again, this is from the EID. And of course, this wasn't just one single intervention that did this. It was a result of many evidence-based interventions, which came out of this ongoing approach where there was a sustained long-term commitment by the industry to engage with the research and a huge amount of work to bring many, many people along with that plan. And, while as statisticians, we would usually hesitate to say, well, this 38% reduction is the result of our work, because we can't really prove that. It is the thing that really, for me personally, like seeing the work translated into the real world, as a result of the people involved in the Jockey Club bringing everybody in the sport along with it, is amazing. So this aggregation of marginal gains is the way to go. Adding surface data into the mix could improve our understanding of the many risk factors that horses are exposed to. And I would say actually would improve our understanding, because we can be pretty confident that the surface has quite an impact on the horses, right? It's still not going to explain everything, of course. And so we'll always be trying to add caveats and asterisks to everything, saying, well, there's still no magic solutions. But what will pay off is a commitment to continuing to build on the progress and continuing to act on the evidence. So my 4-point plan for what's next, if you like, is that surface data risk factors could feasibly be added to epidemiological models if these conditions can be created. So number one is we can reconcile the variables to the race start level. And that's so that we can include them with all of the other variables that are at that level. And it's because the outcome of interest, the fatality, is at that level, or whatever your outcome of interest in other sports or other jurisdictions are. Ideally, the data would be available from all tracks, or at least for a substantial number. This is the part that's probably going to take the most time. Ideally, the data would be recorded systematically and consistently in a useful form. And finally, really importantly, again, so this isn't just an academic exercise, the form of the variables needs to be explainable so that the models are explainable, so that when you run the model and get result, you can say to the industry, hey, here's this risk factor. If you do this, it will reduce the risk by whatever amount. There has to be a clearly communicable outcome in terms of like, what is the intervention? It might be that, we could throw the data as it currently stands into a model and find that the amount of rainfall at the top corner of the track 3 days before the race is associated with the risk of fatality. But how would we actually implement that in reality? So this is, of course, the ideal situation. You might say it's the sort of impossible utopian dream. And the reality is that some of these will be very challenging to achieve for some variables, but they'll be much easier to achieve for others. Hence, we aim for aggregation of marginal gains. We don't have to do everything to be successful here. We just have to do a lot of little things. So for reconciling to race start level, I've got a 2x2 matrix of complexity, if you like, for the challenge level for integrating track surface data into my sort of risk factor models. Of course, others are working on other models, and there's plenty of work to go around. The low temporal frequency, low spatial frequency variables are relatively easy, and we can imagine adding them to the EID, for example, on an annual basis without changing too much. So that's great. The low temporal frequency, high spatial frequency variables, there's a challenge to flatten them in space. Can we get them to average out the measurements that are taken in multiple locations on the track? Can we work out how to average that out to one per race start? For the high temporal frequency, low spatial frequency variables, there's a challenge to flatten in time. So same idea. How can we get this resolved at the level of the race start? And the most complex ones are the variables that are both high frequency in space and in time. There are 2 dimensions to flatten there. And my gut feeling is these are the most difficult ones that will take the longest to figure out. But doesn't mean we shouldn't try. For achieving coverage of all tracks and systematic data recording, the major strengths of the GEIS, the EID, and the Hong Kong database is their completeness, without a doubt. These data sets are incredibly impressive compared to other data sets I've worked with across a variety of fields, not just for equine sports. The completeness, the consistency, and the lack of missing or confusing data is exceptional, and it is testament to the people that are collecting these data that they are such high quality. It is not easy to set that up and maintain it. So the goal would be that if we were to try and add surface data in to the mix for epidemiological studies, we would want to aim to reach that level of completeness, which is why, a lot of my sort of initial thinking is, how can we add this to the EID? Because that's the best route to maintain or to reach and maintain this systematic recording. Of course, this will take time, and it will require a lot of effort from many different people and at different levels of the sport. So if we can collectively narrow down the list of potential risk factors and figure out the forms that would be most useful for these before we start to do all that work, this would make this task much more achievable over a shorter timescale. If we were to say now, we've got however many tens or hundreds of variables that are available, let's just do them all, that would create an overwhelming amount of work for potentially little payoff. So if we're strategic and thoughtful about this, we can make it much more achievable. And then finally, explainable forms of the variables. So if we consider the high frequency data that's available, that's immediately tens of millions of new data points. And that's frankly just not manageable because we need to have some sort of human oversight of this. We can't just feed it into a computer and wait for it to tell us the answer. We also need to consider the factors such as heavy rain for a track in one area might have completely different consequences compared to heavy rain in a different area. So we'll account for other local factors. So this means that it's unlikely that the variable, if we're talking about rainfall, we're unlikely to have just one variable of, was there a lot of rain that day? Yes or no. It'll have to be, was it a lot of rain today? And is it in a dry area? Or is it in a wet area? And this is an extension of the multifactorial nature of all of the other work, right? So it's not a new idea. Similarly, a variable that looks along the lines of what was the ground penetration at the 15th post 7 feet in the perpendicular direction is very unlikely to be generalizable. And it's unlikely to be particularly useful. So how do we flatten that high spatial frequency data to the race start level? And how do we encapsulate some sort of ground penetration measurements at the level of, this is the significant average or something like that for this race start? Again, I don't have an answer for that right now. This is the challenge to figure out. Okay, so final summary. Like I said earlier, my focus here has been on what do we need to do to add surface data into race level risk factor models. Now, of course, this isn't the only game in town. There is plenty of work to go around, and all of it is valuable, and because it all progresses towards that goal of reducing the risk to the horses, right? And we know that progress can be made and has been made reducing the risk to horses by working collaboratively both within the scientific community and between industry and academia. So it's really exciting to see the possibilities here and what we can achieve with widespread surface data availability. However, we've got a lot of work to do to make it happen. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much, folks. I always include a picture of my dog at the end of a lecture. My students really appreciate it, so I'm doing the same here. Thanks very much. I'm happy to take any questions.